Anyone who's a fan of war movies or the history of the Second World War has probably seen the 1962 film about the D-Day landings, The Longest Day. It never ceases to amaze me that many of the stars in some of the classic movies about the Second World War were actually World War II veterans themselves, none more so than one of the stars in this particular film. Richard Todd played the role of Major John Howard, who led the highly successful airborne attack on Pegasus Bridge. Todd had already found fame in another action movie set during the war, The Dam Busters. What is fantastic about his role in The Longest Day was that he was actually fighting in Normandy on D-Day himself. But what is even better is that he was fighting alongside the real Major Howard at Pegasus Bridge on the 6th of June 1944. This is the D-Day story of Lieutenant Richard Todd of the British 6th Airborne Brigade at Pegasus Bridge. Richard Todd was born in 1919 in Dublin, the son of a British Army surgeon, and it seemed that young Richard would follow in his father's footsteps and join the army, until he fell in love with acting. Rather than heading off to the British Army's officer training school at Royal Military College Sandhurst, he ended up at the Italia Conti School for Acting in London. Established by the actress Italia Conti in 1911, the school has produced a series of household names over the years, including Noel Coward, Jack Hawkins and Clive Dunn. Upon completion of his studies, Todd moved to Scotland, where he helped set up the Dundee Rep Theatre in the late 1930s. He also managed to get himself roles as an extra in several pre-war films, including A Yank at Oxford. Now, if that film rings a bell, maybe it's because it's appeared in one of my other stories. Second World War hero Jack Churchill, who I've spoken about, also appeared in this film during a rowing race. On the 4th of September 1939, the day after Great Britain declared war on Germany, Todd travelled from Dundee to nearby St Andrews University to attend an army recruitment event. Blagging his way past university reception, he then put on the performance of his life, convincing the army recruiting team that not only was he studying English at the university and had been for 6 months, but was also in their officer training corps. He made the grade, and after his detour with acting, finally ended up at the Royal Military College Sandhurst after all. It was whilst at the officer training college that Todd had one of many pieces of luck that he was to be gifted with during the war. On the night of the 29th of January 1941, a solitary bomb dropped by a German aircraft hit C block of the college as Todd was walking along the corridor. He was blown out of the building onto a nearby embankment. Initially he thought he was unharmed, but upon closer inspection, in the light, it transpired that he had actually received many small wounds from the blast. He was one of 26 casualties in that bombing. Todd passed out as a second lieutenant that spring and had another lucky escape. Travelling to London on the 8th of March, Todd headed to his favourite restaurant cum nightclub, the Café de Paris, where some of his fellow newly commissioned officers were celebrating. However, he arrived late and was refused entry as the restaurant was full. He had to celebrate elsewhere. That night, the Café de Paris received a direct hit from a German bomb. 34 people were killed, including several newly commissioned officers. Just as an aside, 2 months later, the Italia Conti acting school in London was also destroyed in another air raid. Richard Todd, who had been badgering his superiors to see some action, was posted to the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry, who were guarding the coastline of Kent. Todd was put in charge of the Dymchurch Redoubt, an old fort built during the Napoleonic Wars. If you wanted action, this was the place to be. Kent was right in the path of any German invasion, and the Dymchurch Redoubt was in the very front line of the coastal defences. As it was, no invasion happened, and by the end of the year he was posted to Iceland to undertake Arctic warfare training. Training completed, he then applied to go on a 2-month signals course in Yorkshire, despite having no signals experience. Once more, Todd's acting skills came to the fore as he blagged his way through the course. This included him delivering a lecture on the atomic theory of electricity, which he knew would baffle most of the other candidates. There's nothing like bamboozling your opposition into thinking you're clever. The only problem was that if most of his audience, and probably some of the instructors, didn't know much about Todd's chosen subject, neither did he. And so he learned the lecture line by line, just like he'd learned lines at the Dundee Rep Theatre. The end result was that he passed out second from top of a class of 100 candidates. This training was all well and good, but it wasn't getting him any closer to action. In 1943, Lieutenant Richard Todd applied to join the newly formed Parachute Regiment. Completing his jump course, he was posted to the 7th Light Infantry Battalion of the Parachute Regiment, part of the 6th Airborne Division. And it was with the 6th Airborne that Todd was finally going to go into battle, and not just any battle, the D-Day landings in Normandy on the 6th of June 1944. We look back now and it can be easy to assume that the success of D-Day was inevitable. The largest armada of ships ever assembled, 6,000 of them, with over 5,000 planes providing air cover, enabling 156,000 troops to land in Normandy in a single day. But the Germans knew that an invasion was imminent and had gathered armoured divisions inland ready to race to wherever the Allies landed. And if those panzers, together with supporting infantry, could arrive before sufficient numbers of Allied troops, and more importantly tanks and guns, could get ashore, the whole operation could end up similar to the disastrous Dieppe raid back in 1942. It was the eastern flank of that 60-mile invasion front that was particularly vulnerable. If the Germans could launch a counterattack from there, they could roll up the whole invasion force beach by beach. The flank would somehow need to be secured before the men came ashore. The task was given to General Richard Gale of the 6th Airborne Division. Gale, who for obvious reasons was known to his troops as Windy Gale, came up with an audacious plan. His division would conduct a coup de main, or surprise attack, before the coastal landings and capture 2 key bridges on the eastern flank. These 2 bridges, crossing the Caen Canal and the Orne River respectively, would prevent German armour counterattacking and, if captured intact, would give the Allies a means to break out of their beachhead. He determined that this daring and risky attack would be carried out by his own airborne division. Its insignia, drawn from the Greek mythology depicting the winged horse Pegasus, would in time give the landings and the Caen Bridge a new name, Pegasus Bridge. Gale's airborne division consisted of the Air Landing Brigade, troops specialising in glider landings, the nucleus of which were drawn from the Ox and Bucks Light Infantry, and the 3rd and 5th Parachute Brigades. 6 Horsa gliders containing 180 men from D Company, the Ox and Bucks Light Infantry, under the commander Major John Howard, would land as close to the bridges as possible and seize them intact. Howard set up 2 call signals if successful: Ham for the capture of the Canal Bridge and Jam for capturing the River Orme Bridge intact. Their landing, timed for 16 minutes past midnight, would be followed by parachute landings just to their east, at 10 to 1. The Paras would then assemble in Ronville, advance on the River Orme Bridge and then onto the Caen Bridge, and there they would join Howard's company and dig in until the men landing on the beaches at dawn could finally move up to relieve them. Amongst the 5th Parachute Brigade scheduled to jump on the 6th of June, with the 7th Battalion of the Parachute Regiment, including Lieutenant Richard Todd. On the 1st of June 1944, Todd was amongst 30 officers of 7 Para who were briefed on their mission by their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Geoffrey Pine Coffin. That is truly his surname, and men of his battalion, with a certain gallows humour, nicknamed him Wooden Box. Born in 1908 near Bideford in Devon, the commander would jump with his men in the early hours of the 6th of June, and he'd jump again the following year as the Allies finally crossed the River Rhine. But that was in the future. If they didn't get this jump right, there would be no Rhine crossing. On the 5th of June 1944, the men of 7 Para prepared to go into action. The final act before boarding their planes at Fairford Airfield in Gloucestershire was to attend a drumhead service. 600 men in full battle fatigues, their faces blackened, stood in a semicircle around their chaplain. The chaplain, 29-year-old Captain George Parry, stood on an ammunition box to conduct the service. Parry had completed his jump training a few months before Richard Todd and was known amongst the men as Pissy Percy, the parachuting parson. And the parachuting parson would join his flock jumping over Normandy in the dark morning of the 6th of June. Todd remembered the men singing Onward Christian Soldiers with gusto, but also remembered that many choked and went silent as they sang the words to Abide With Me. And then the men silently boarded the Sterling bombers that would transport them into Nazi-occupied Europe. Sitting in what is called stick order, Todd would be the first man out of their plane. And as they were embarking that night at Gloucestershire, Lady Luck was to save his life again. Todd's plane was to be number 36th in the line of approach, but suddenly a senior RAF officer boarded the plane and announced that they would be number 1 in line. Todd tried to argue that the numbers had been carefully allocated and the plans made around them. The RAF officer was senior enough for Lieutenant Todd not to argue too forcefully, and he now found himself the lead jumper in the leading plane. As it would turn out, that RAF officer did Todd a favour. The early waves of bombers arriving over Normandy took the German defenders by surprise. However, as he recalled later, around about plane 20 the Germans actually woke up, and many of the later planes, including the new number 36, were shot down. By the time Todd and the 7 Para were in the air, the 6 Horsa gliders being towed by Halifax bombers were closing in on their target. At 16 minutes past midnight on the 6th of June 1944, the lead glider, piloted by Staff Sergeant Jim Walwick, landed exactly on target, next to the Caen Canal Bridge. The glider landings to capture the 2 bridges are an incredible story, and one that I will tell separately, because those men deserve their own space. 24-year-old Jim Walwick from Manchester managed to land on target in the dead of night, on schedule, crushing the German barbed wire defences in the process. Air Chief Marshal Lee Mallory, commanding Allied air forces on that day, called it the greatest feat of flying in the war. Catching the Germans completely by surprise, Howard received the message ham. They had captured the steel girder bridge crossing the canal. It was shortly followed by jam. The river bridge was also theirs. It had taken 10 minutes from their landing. Now they had to hang on against the German counterattacks that they had been advised would start within the hour. Even before the main German armoured panzer division under Colonel von Luck would arrive, they would have to deal with a sizable local enemy force on their doorstep. Across the canal, the German garrisons in Bonneville and Le Port could muster 6 tanks, some artillery, and 24 platoons of infantry. Against them, Howard could offer no armour, no artillery, and just 6 platoons of D Company, Ox and Bucks Light Infantry. And already, the 31-year-old Major Howard, who had taken over a pillbox on the northeast corner of the bridge, could hear German panzer engines warming up across the canal in Le Port. They needed those parachute reinforcements, and fast. 10 minutes later, Lieutenant Richard Todd found himself standing over the gaping bomb hole in the bottom of the Stirling, staring at the white crests of the waves as they finished their crossing of the Channel and hit France. Standing astride the hole, he had a kit bag containing a rubber dinghy tied to one leg, and a kit bag containing entrenching tools tied to the other. And just to add to the cumbersome jump, he had a Sten gun strapped across his chest, and his pouches were stuffed with grenades and ammunition. Suddenly, at 10-1, inside the plane, the green jump light flashed on. Richard Todd jumped through the bomb bay and into the night. Down on the ground, Major Howard heard the bombers overhead and on schedule. He looked up into the sky. German searchlights were crisscrossing the darkness. Tracers were firing upwards. And then across the sky, he saw dozens and dozens of parachutes. Whatever happened with the beach landings, at least his men were no longer alone. 7 Para would be with them. Howard started to blow on a whistle to direct the parachutists towards him. Dat, 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 da. The Morse code for V. V for victory. And across the quiet of the night, interspersed with the odd rattle of small arms fire, that whistle carried for kilometres, calling the Paras towards the bridges. Upon landing, 2 minutes later, Todd was completely disorientated. He couldn't see the steeple of the church at Ronville, which was to be their directional guide towards the bridges. Suddenly, he felt very alone. He loaded his Sten gun and headed towards a wood a little way from him to get under some sort of cover. Diving into the wood, he heard a sound. Howard's whistle. In later years, veterans would recall that whistle, telling them that the bridges were captured and helping them to orientate themselves in the darkness. And above all, Howard's whistle told them they weren't alone. The drop hadn't been as accurate as the glider landings, and the Paras were scattered over a wide area. Whilst he was in the wood, Todd was joined by his commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Pine Coffin. More and more men started to come in, but still nowhere near full strength. Just 150 of the 600 men who had boarded at Fairford joined them in the wood. Finally, at 1:10 a.m, Pine Coffin decided to advance on the bridges with what he had. They arrived not a moment too soon. The German counterattack started at around 1:30, almost exactly an hour after the glider landings, just as intelligence had predicted. A panzer advanced to the T-junction in Bonneville leading towards the Canal Bridge. Sergeant Thornton from D Company hit it with a Piat handheld rocket, sort of like a British version of a bazooka. The rocket penetrated the tank and hit its magazine, and a veritable firework display now erupted for the next 30 minutes. Almost at the moment that the panzer blew up, Pine Coffin and the men of 7 Para arrived at the Canal Bridge. They moved swiftly across to take up positions on the far western side to resist further counterattacks. Todd initially took up a defensive position on a knoll just before the church at Le Port. As the morning wore on, the Germans launched a series of attacks, which grew in ferocity with the arrival of the 8th Heavy Grenadiers. Despite their name, they were, fortunately for the British, lightly armed, but they outnumbered the defenders and started to push them back through Benneville towards the canal. During one of those attacks, the Germans overran the regimental aid post, killing everyone inside, including Captain George Parry. P.C. Percy, the parachuting parson, died trying to protect the wounded men. At the same time, over in Le Port, Todd was pinned down by a German sniper who had taken up position in the church tower. Eventually, Corporal Colleen of 7 Para managed to slowly move along a row of cottages before firing a Piat anti-tank rocket at the tower. He was to tell his story to a BBC reporter who had accompanied the airborne into the battle aboard one of the gliders, Chester Wilmot. Corporal Colleen told the BBC reporter how he had dislodged the sniper, but even in the heat of battle, the religious Irishman had taken off his helmet when he had entered the church. Todd, meanwhile, was moving forward with 4 or 5 mortar men. Suddenly, in the growing daylight, he saw the glint of a helmet poking up a little way in front of them. Motioning for the men to take cover, Todd stalked his prey, only to find it was one of his own men, a young teenager, lying dead. Shortly before dawn, the men at the bridges felt the ground shake, and then a roar rolled across the airwaves. The assault on the beaches had started. Looking to the north towards the coast, they could see smoke rising from the massive naval and aerial bombardment. Fingers crossed, relief would arrive by 11 a.m, but they'd have to hold out until then. And remember, the airborne had captured 2 bridges well inland from the coast. They might have the bridges, but they were effectively surrounded. The fighting was confusing, it was mixed up, there were no real front lines. Throughout the morning, the men had to hold on as the Germans fought back. Private Dennis Edwards was with a group of men pinned down by a German machine gun. As it fired again, 2 officers slithered down beside them for cover. He immediately recognised the battalion commanding officer, Pine Coffin. As more bullets ripped the bark off a tree just above them, the colonel announced in classic British understatement that it was a shade too close for comfort. Suddenly, the colonel and the other officer accompanying him got up and dashed through a hedge. Shortly afterwards, Davis heard the distinctive rat-tat-tat of a British Sten gun. The 2 officers reappeared, and the smiling colonel announced, "Well, lads, that's fixed him up." It was only after the war that Dennis Edwards realised that the other officer was Richard Todd. Todd himself had a story from his time accompanying Pine Coffin that morning. At some stage, the commanding officer ordered Todd to join him as he tried to find Major Howard, and as they made their way forward, a German sniper fired on them. Pine Coffin had armed himself with a telescopic sight on his rifle and coolly returned fire. Whether he killed the sniper is unclear, but there were no more shots, and they proceeded on their way. By 11 a.m, there was no sign of the British forces moving inland from the coast. The invasion, it seemed to the men at the bridges, was running behind schedule. As the morning wore on, the British force at the bridges also had to see off an attack by 2 German gunboats which had sailed up from the coast, and at least 2 German frogmen who were attempting to place explosives beneath the canal bridge. At around midday, Todd finally heard the skirl of bagpipes approaching from the coast. It was Lord Lovat, at the head of his commandos. Lovat, a colourful character who probably deserves a story in his own right along with his commandos, was marching at the head of his men, wearing his green beret, a white sweater, and carrying a walking stick. Alongside him was his personal piper, Bill Millin. They were greeted by the exhausted airborne troops, red and green berets mixing together. The 6th Airborne had done their duty. They'd captured the 2 bridges intact, and then they'd held them. Now, with reinforcements arriving, the eastern flank of the D-Day landing was secure. As Lovat's commandos marched across the canal bridge, Todd noticed that someone had chalked up a new name on it. Honouring the Airborne Division's badge. Honouring the Airborne Division's badge. The new name simply read Pegasus Bridge. Not long after D-Day, Richard Todd was recalled to England, but was later able to rejoin the regiment before the war ended. And after victory in Europe, Todd and the regiment were posted to Palestine, where he was seriously injured when his jeep overturned. Following demobilisation in 1946, Richard Todd returned to his acting career. He starred alongside future US President Ronald Reagan in The Hasty Heart, which earned him an Academy Award nomination. With his looks and his well-earned and real swashbuckling style, Todd found himself in war movies such as The Yangtze Incident and The Long and the Short and the Tall. Probably his high point came when he was chosen to play the role of Wing Commander Guy Gibson VC in the epic British World War II action movie The Dam Busters. Bringing history full circle, in 1962 Richard Todd was chosen to play the role of Major John Howard in the film about D-Day, The Longest Day. Throughout his later life, he continued to actively support 617 Dam Buster Squadron as well as D-Day memorial activities. Todd's last film appearance was in the early 1990s when he played Victorian soldier Field Marshal Lord Roberts in the Sherlock Holmes mystery Incident at Victoria Falls. He retired to Lincolnshire, where he passed away in 2009. The story of the capture of Pegasus Bridge on D-Day is truly incredible, and having visited Pegasus Bridge myself, it's a story that I will tell you here on another occasion. But it came at a heavy price. Almost half of the 7th Battalion of the Parachute Regiment were casualties on that opening day of D-Day. Overall, the 6th Airborne Division lost 1,500 men, dead, wounded or missing, 15% of the total Allied casualties on D-Day. For my final words, I'll turn once more to Richard Todd. In 2004, on the 60th anniversary of the D-Day landings, he visited the field where he had landed in Normandy. Reflecting on his own actions at Pegasus Bridge, he told the BBC, "Why do people have to go on bringing bloodshed and war? Come and look at Normandy. You wouldn't want to do this all over again." Powerful words. Lest we forget. Richard Todd, actor and D-Day veteran, 1919 to 2009. Thank you for joining me today for this story, and I will tell you the story about Major Howard and that incredible glider landing at Pegasus Bridge as soon as I've written it. But in the meantime, why not join my supporters club? Thanks for your support, keep well, and I look forward to you joining me for another story from history very soon.